morning to everyone. And Lee, of course, I'm the one that imposed on Lee and Katie this morning to ask them for this Joke of Heart rendition. There was one verse in that song that really struck with me. I'm going to repeat it. We sung it here. It's the third verse. It preaches today. It's very meaningful to me. It said, "Come, ye weary, heavy laden, lost and ruined by the fall. If you tarry till you're better, you will never come at all." I thought that, to me, was the most significant verse. That song is very contemporary, too. It translates very well. The word's 200 plus years old. A number of, yeah. Not close enough? How's that? All right. I was doing just a little bit of research. That song's been recorded quite a bit in the last several years. They do different versions of that same song, and they're all good. So if you ever take time, look it up, play a couple of those. I think you'll find it very meaningful. All right. Well, we are continuing our studies. Steve was good enough to lead us last week, and for this quarter we're studying the discipleship and mission. Last week, Steve reviewed humility and hospitality. This week, our lesson is on a costly call. Has anybody ever started a project that seemed like a good idea, a major project, a significant project that seemed like a good idea until you got into it, and then it was so demanding? Overwhelming, yeah. I'm going to tell them myself. I know what Linda's pointing to me. Linda Morris. We were neighbors years ago, and growing up, I grew up after we left the farm and came to town. Growing up in South Nashville, a number of the families in Nashville, with 2-bedroom post-World War II homes, most of them didn't have a basement. And a number of the fathers in our community dug the dirt out from underneath the house and made their own basement. And my father did the same thing. I was too little to dig and not strong enough to push the wheelbarrow, so I watched my older brother and my dad dig dirt, and eventually pour floor, lay block, and we had a basement. And that's where I grew up. That was my bedroom downstairs. And so we did that. When I moved back home, we were in service for a number of years. I moved back home. The home we purchased in '84 did not have a basement, and I really wanted a basement. I really wanted a basement. But we did, and we lived next door to the Morrises. They eventually moved in shortly. And so I thought, well, my dad dug a basement. Many of my neighbors dug a basement. I too can dig a basement. So I went to the crawl space and got on my hands and knees, opened the door, and it wasn't 3 feet of space in there. I literally dug a small hole with a small shovel so I could stand in it. So it was underneath my house in a small hole, standing up, and I took a pick and shortened the handle so I could swing it, and that's how I commenced digging dirt out from underneath my basement. I did it for 2 years, drove the neighbors crazy. It was the oddest thing, especially anyone who wasn't from the area, could not understand why you would be doing that. And it was a crazy project. It was crazy. I dug for over 2 years. I hit rock. And that was after I got into it. If I hit rock the first day, I probably would have quit. I hit rock when I was about a third of the way into it. I went one morning. I showed up and I sit down, put on my work boots, flipped on the light, and my riding lawnmower was floating in 3 feet of water. So it just got worse and worse. It got so bad, I even brought somebody in, and they said, the only way I can get the rock out is by blasting it out. I was stuck. I was stuck because I started this project. I didn't want to embarrass myself. I had dirt out all over the yard. Neighbors were asking me constantly what was going on. People didn't even know what was going on. So eventually the project was completed, and I did have a basement, and then we moved. So I surely I did not calculate the cost of that project.
Mike?
Yeah.
Just so you'll know, a couple of people later that moved in, the Robinsons, Sana and Keith Robinson, who go to church here, he re-engineered and was able to direct the water where it doesn't go in the basement. So you could have stayed.
Well, actually, I thought I had corrected that problem. That was about 3 months worth of work to try to get rid of the water. But, okay. So often we will take on a project without calculating the cost, and that's a little bit of our lesson today. This week we're going to examine the cost of Christian discipleship. If you remember, Jesus' ministry didn't begin when he was born, and it didn't begin when he was 12 years old. He went to the synagogue and spent time with the elders there. It didn't begin at his baptism. He wasn't in his ministry at that time either, and his ministry really did not begin until after the arrest of John the Baptist. And so there was a time between the arrest of John the Baptist, going to the wilderness, returning back, and gathering his disciples there. His first disciples that he approached were two brothers, Andrew and Simon Peter. And they were at a cove fishing, Tabgha. And many of us who went on the Israel trip, we went to Tabgha and we saw this. It was a fishing area. And when they fished the Sea of Galilee, they didn't go out in the water, which I just learned. I simply went out in the deepest part of the water and they fished. And they fished much closer to the shore. And that's why often there would be communication between the shore and those that were fishing on their boats. Or often they could also fish from the shore. They did not go out in the deepest part of the lake. And the biggest reason was because the weather was unpredictable. It could be very dangerous to go out there and a storm come up, which we witnessed all of us on the trip. The storm did come up before we could get back to shoreline there. So that happened. So let's start. We got two passages today we're going to look at. We're going to read Mark and from Luke. Mark 1, 16 through 20. As Jesus passed along the Galilee Sea, he saw two brothers, Simon and Andrew, throwing fishing nets into the sea, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, he said, and I'll show you how to fish for people. Right away, they left their nets and followed him. After going a little further, he saw James and John, Zebedee's sons, in their boat, repairing the fishing nets. At that very moment, he called them. They followed him, leaving their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired workers. That seems awful fast, doesn't it? I mean, he shows up and says, come follow me. They jump out of the boat, leave their family, their hired workers, and follow Jesus. But it didn't occur that fast. Most likely, Jesus, they were familiar. Jesus and the disciples, they were familiar with each other. Remember, they were following John the Baptist. And John the Baptist was leading this religious revival, and not Jesus. Jesus went to John the Baptist. And Jesus essentially waited until John the Baptist's mission was complete before he stepped forward. Many thought John the Baptist was Elijah, and Jesus even commented that, implied that John the Baptist was really the return of Elijah himself. When we talk about here in this verse that fishing for people, when you fish, you capture fish and you consume the fish. That's what they did. And fishing was a huge industry. And back at the time, Peter was probably very well off. There was a growing population. Herod the king was there and increased the population of the area. And there was a lot of business for Peter. Peter especially is believed to have a very successful fishing business. But when you fish, you use hooks, possibly, or nets. Mostly they use nets. But Jesus' imaging of fishing for people is not capturing, but gathering people. There's a significant difference there. when Peter and Andrew jumped out of the boat, left behind their family and their hired workers, they forever changed their lives. They never returned. They never really returned back to fishing. For there was a short time there after Jesus' death, they thought they was going back to fishing. But at his appearance again, they realized they would never again return to that form of life. And their life was very provincial there in the Galilee Sea. They spent all their time, most of their time right there in Galilee. Occasionally they might go to Jerusalem for a festival or something, but their lives were at the water, were at the sea. That's what they did. Everybody they knew, everybody associated with was right there. And you imagine what their lives became later as they became followers of Jesus, as we turned from disciples to apostles, and they ventured out, and the responsibilities, their lives changed forever when they elected to follow Jesus. Our author mentioned, we're familiar with the actor Kirk Cameron? Your children are, anyway. In the late 80s into the 90s, he was on the show, Growing Pains, very popular TV show. Kurt, and he was a teenager at the time he was on the show, but he was an atheist. He was a young man. He considered himself an atheist, but he did find religion. He did find faith. He did find Christianity. And before the show was over, he was very careful about the lines, the storylines that he would play, and he would refuse to play some of the lines if he thought that it did not uphold his Christian beliefs. He eventually left the contemporary industry as we know it, and today he's making many, the films that he makes are Christian-based films. There have been a number of popular ones, I can't recall the name of them, but there was one last year or two that had quite a bit of success. He was willing to give up his life, his very successful acting career, to pursue other endeavors, although he still is in the industry. He's in the Christian industry of filmmaking today. Does anyone know Katie Davis from Brentwood? Do you remember Katie Davis? Probably somebody may know her personally, and I believe she attended the Baptist church. Yeah, that's right. That's right. She, after she graduated from Brentwood High School, and she did very well at Brentwood High School. She had certain offices and a very popular girl. She took a mission trip to Uganda after high school, before college. She came home and she was so moved by the work that she was doing in Uganda. She eventually went back to Uganda. The last I heard, she was spending her life there. Does anybody have an update on Katie? She adopted 13. I believe they're all girls. Yeah, I think they're, and she is their adopted foster mother, and that's her life. She had every reason to go to, had every intention to go to nursing school, but she went to just a church mission trip to Uganda. She really has never left. That is her work, and that's the last I've heard of Katie. And so that's somebody that we know of locally. It's very precious. She took the call and she pursued it. Yes.
She is now married to somebody locally over there, has had her own child and will live there forever.
She's still there.
That's what her mother said.
That's an amazing story. That's such a. She has married. Katie has married. I don't know. Okay. She has married. She has her own biological child now, and she is still in Uganda, serving Christ for that mission. And she took that responsibility on at 18, maybe 19 years old. So it's quite an impressive story. After Jesus saw Simon and Andrew, he moved on to more fishermen. It was James and John. James and John was recognized as the son of Zebedee. I don't know how Zebedee. That's all I know about Zebedee. It's his children, his two boys, but James and John. And if you look at these four disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter, James, and John, 4 times the disciples are listed in our Bible. I'm not sure if somebody can help me. I think it's Matthew and Luke and Acts. And there's another time that they're mentioned. But when they're mentioned, they're listed. Peter is always listed first. He's always on the first of the list. And these other 4 disciples are always in the top third. So there's a hierarchy, a priority with discipleship. These 4 make it. And again, James and John, they leave their father They leave everything they know. And why would they leave so suddenly is the question. But if you remember, at Jesus' baptism, when he was baptized, John the Baptist recognized Jesus as the Lamb of God. And two of the disciples, we know, I think Simon, or Andrew, I believe it's Andrew, and if somebody knows more, let me know. Andrew was there. He heard that, and he told his brother Simon, John the Baptist, who they were disciples of John the Baptist essentially, said, he has designated Jesus as the Son of God. So they were not unfamiliar with Jesus when he came by the shore and said, follow me. It was something they were, Jesus came to them because he had just left the wilderness. He came to them and said, it is time. Now we are ready. And they knew what he was speaking. This was not new information. Okay. And they weren't chosen because they were the choice. They were chosen because Jesus knew what they could accomplish, what they would do eventually. Remember, Peter was very argumentative. He argued with anybody. He argued with Jesus. And which one of us is going to argue with Jesus? But Peter was. He would argue with Jesus. He denied Jesus. I mean, you know the expression with friends like this and these enemies? Well, I think this is where it originated right there. James and John, what were they doing? They were positioning themselves to see who could sit at the next to Jesus when his kingdom reigns. That's what they were doing. They were thinking of themselves. But yet Jesus wanted them. And they never did understand Jesus' earthly mission. They never did quite understand his impending death. That was something that they just could not wrap their minds around. Even though Jesus would speak of it, they were not sure. They were not in that thought that would occur. And then when Jesus did go to his death, where were they? They weren't to be seen. They were all gone, all 12 of them. They weren't there. But Jesus still called on them. In the United States, 75% of Americans are identified as Christians. You know what it takes to be called a Christian? How you're identified as a Christian? Raise your right hand. That's it. That's all you got to do. Nobody's going to ask you, okay, prove it. Prove that you're a Christian. So you take a survey and they ask, that's what your faith is. If you say Christian, it's just a check mark. No one's asking you to prove it. No one's asking you, well, what do you do? It's only a claim. They don't ask you about your behavior. They don't ask you about your practice. They don't ask any evidence. And so these are what we call nominal Christians. And when John the Baptist was preaching in the wilderness, he was talking about, his message was all must repent and cleansed by God to prepare for God's kingdom. And Jesus appears at his baptism, and John calls Jesus the Lamb of God. The voice of heaven also confirms that this is God's Son. Jesus went 40 days in the wilderness where he was tempted by Satan. I think that more accurately, Satan tried to tempt Jesus. I don't think Jesus ever would be weak enough to be tempted. I find that, for me personally, I find that hard to believe. But that's what we say, Jesus was tempted. Jesus triumphs over the devil's test and returns to repeat John's message. And then this is when he starts calling his disciples. In the and Jesus was calling his disciples, and the way they worked the disciples was the disciples would go and live with the religious teacher. They would spend time with them. They were studying, but they were also observing the teacher, and that's what all the religious, the Jewish teachers would do. Jesus was fishing for people. He wasn't fishing for fish. And let's see. And so even though the disciples were having a difficult time understanding Jesus' message, and they never did really quite get it up until after his resurrection, Jesus kept inviting them back, and he commissioned them. After his death, they got promoted. It went from disciples to apostles. And what an apostle is a messenger. All apostles are disciples, but not all disciples can be apostles. These 12 were elected as apostles, and they were sent out to continue Jesus' mission here on earth. And why would he continue these 12 after they failed him so many times? Well, it's persistent grace. God is an example of God's grace. All right. Now we're going to go read Luke 14. We counted the cost of being called. Yeah, sure.
Can you imagine how Simon and Andrew must have felt, or what they felt, when this guy they've never seen before says, "Come and I'll make you fisher"?
Well, actually, they did know. Jesus, there's some belief that Jesus prepared his discipleship. He was preparing for his mission. He spent as much time in preparation as he actually did on his mission work. They were not unfamiliar. Most likely they were unfamiliar because John the Baptist had called them out, and they were followers of John the Baptist. So this was not new to them. But you're right, that would be hard to imagine. Now if you remember, Jesus, he was having a large following. He was drawing large crowds. In fact, when we get to Luke, this is what we'll discuss. It was well known. It was not. He was well known among the Jewish, the Israeli people, Israelites. It was well known then. He was well known by some of the Romans. He was not well received by them, but he was well received by the people that he would often preach to. And honestly, the biggest draw was the miracles. His message was not clear, but they loved the miracles. That was the big attention, the miracles that he performed. Okay, we're going to read Luke 14, 25 through 33. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus. Turning to them, he said, "Whoever comes to me and doesn't hate father and mother, spouses and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even one's own life, cannot be my disciple. Whoever doesn't carry their own cross and follow me cannot be my disciple." Boy, what a slam that was. Can you imagine here? The most important thing in their lives is their family. And God saying, and Jesus telling them, if you don't hate your father and mother, your spouse and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even one's own life, if you don't even hate yourself, you cannot be my disciple. Whoever doesn't carry their own cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Well, the family relationships are very, very sacred, like it is to us today. They're very sacred. They're very most important to us. Faithfulness to your family is demanded by God's law. And here he's saying, well, you even need to hate your own life. But what is this? This is exaggeration. This is hyperbole. Hey, anybody ever said they're so hungry they could eat a horse? I mean, how many people think their feet are killing them? Yeah. Well, we all say that. Have you ever exaggerated to your children to get them to behave? Say something outrageous? And what is that?
You're grounded for the rest of your life.
Grounded for the rest of your life. You're punishing both parties when you do that. But it gets their attention. It does. Yeah, it does. But Jesus often used hyperbole and exaggeration. If your eye, for example, your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. Lisa.
It's interesting that he's telling them to take up their cross and follow him when he, at that point, it's almost like it's probably a foreshadowing of him going to the cross, like
Sure.
he knew about it. They, of course, wouldn't realize. You wonder if they wondered about that phrase, like, what's he talking about? Take up a cross? You know what I mean? It hadn't happened yet.
No, it hadn't happened to Jesus, but it had happened. It happened frequently, a lot. It was, of course, it was the way the Romans would intimidate and rule. The cross and crucifixion was such a horrible, horrible, horrible event. It was so horrible that the words would not even be spoken by the population. It's like we don't sit around and talk about electrocution. We don't talk, it's not hanging. When's the last time you had a discussion about hanging?
We wonder why anyone would want to follow them. talking about, the cross, he was almost telling them, you're gonna be crucified,
He
like
was.
I would, like I am.
That is exactly what he's telling them. And that is part of calculating the cost of following Jesus. That is what he was telling them. Of course, did they comprehend, have an understanding? No, they didn't. But that is exactly what he was telling them. It will be expensive to follow him. And Jesus was making his point as he talks about hate here. He said the relationships are important in following Jesus, but following Jesus is more important. That was his point. That it's more important to follow Jesus than it is to love yourself, even love your family members. The most important, number one priority was to follow Jesus. And you had to understand this if you was going to be a disciple of Jesus. Nothing can interfere with being a disciple. It's great to being a disciple is greater than any other relationship. And even though you have a hierarchy of value to Jesus, that doesn't diminish your love for others. That's not what he's asking. He's not asking to love your family less. He wants to be the unchallenged first place. To me, I thought, and I believe I'm correct. I'm a little comfortable thinking this, but do you love your own children more than you love your neighbor's children? I mean, you love your neighbor's children. You do. But do you really not love your own children more? I think if you're honest, you would say yes. Well, this was similar to what Jesus was saying. Yeah, you love your family, love yourself, but you have to love him even more.
It says to love yourself more. Sometimes I don't love myself.
No, certainly. Vice President Mike Pence he's well known for his Christian belief. He practiced it, and he's very much knowledgeable about that. Of course, when he was elected in our today's society, he was questioned. It was questioned if he can have that strong Christian belief and practice and still be a public servant. And the newspapers got a hold of that. Remember one thing that Mike Pence does not do. He does not have dinner with a woman alone unless his wife is with him. It's just a practice that they have. They always say. And the media questioned Karen, his wife, on that quick and said, well, why do you put each other first? And Karen came back and said, no, you misunderstand. We don't put each other first. Mike doesn't put Karen first, and Karen doesn't put Mike first. And she gave a story that when they were first dating, and Karen spoke to Mike Pence and called him her number one. And Mike Pence corrected her and said, if I'm your number one, you will be very disappointed. He said, our Lord has to be number one in our relationship. He said that was a lesson that she's always took. So above fame and power and politics, the family is not number one. But Jesus Christ is number one. Getting back to the cross, I think today we're too familiar with the cross. Today's world is very familiar with the cross. Too familiar, I think. Jesus' life at the cross was a sign of terror. And today we look at the cross as being a sign of hope, a sign of love, a sign of sacrifice. But imagine back in the day when they didn't want to see a cross. It was too horrible to see a cross. Jesus, yeah.
Why do the Catholics, we go into church, Christ is on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
Then the Protestant church is the cross. What's the differentiation there? Why?
Someone, former Catholic would have to explain. I don't know why. Maria?
The resurrection.
Yep.
And
The re-
focusing in the resurrection.
Jesus on the cross represents resurrection to the
The
Catholics.
suffering.
Yes.
And I'm sorry. I see that the Protestant church is more in the resurrection, while the Catholic church is in the suffering that goes to
Crucifixion.
No. Okay.
Yeah.
Jack?
It's really the cross is a sign, when we put Jesus on the cross, that's a visual reminder that Jesus died on the cross for us. It's not just the cross as a sign of sacrifice.
For our sins.
Exactly.
Okay, okay, yeah, very interesting, yeah. Yeah, if you hear the expression, my cross to bear, when people have a tragedy or even inconveniences, and it's a common expression, well, that's my cross to bear. It really was not, the cross to bear is a response often to a loss or that tragedy, but it's not meant to be inferred to an inconvenience or painful circumstances. It's to represent a fallen world. This is life. Tragedies are life. That's what we live in. Unfortunately, it is. Disappointment, heartaches, pain. That is part of our life here on earth. This is part of our fallen world. Rather, the cross we bear is what characterizes the life of one who follows Jesus, serving not ourselves but others as Jesus did on the cross. When Jesus asked us to carry a cross, he's asking us to serve others just as he did. All right, I'm trying to wrap this up here. Verses 28 through 33 in Luke 14 said, if one of you wanted to build a tower, wouldn't you first sit down and calculate the cost to determine whether you have enough money to complete it? Otherwise, when you have laid the foundation but couldn't finish the tower, all who see it will begin to belittle you. They will say, here's a person who began construction and couldn't complete it. Or what king would go to war against another king without first sitting down to consider whether his 10,000 soldiers could go up against the 20,000 coming against him? If he didn't think he could win, he would send a representative to discuss terms of peace while his enemy was still a long way off. In the same way, none of you who are unwilling to give up all your possessions can be my disciple. And Jesus is making a comparison here between building a tower and this war comparison. Commitment to build. Commitment to build would be very expensive. My example of digging out my basement, very expensive. We need to listen carefully to Jesus' teaching. And the incomplete tower is not only just a material failure, it's also a shameful thing. You start a tower, you make this big show, you initially build a tower, but you don't complete it. That would be very shameful, especially back then. You could be mocked by the public. It's a sign of weakness if you don't. In the war parable, it's similar to the tower, except here the builder is free to build. When you build a tower, you make that choice. The king is forced into a situation. He's overpowered. What is he going to do? He has to make a quick decision. But both must be careful in their calculation and take time and complete. All of our life's accomplishments require a lot of cost. Just think about your musicians and your artists and all. They have natural talent most likely, but many of them are practice. Many of our athletes, they have natural talent, but they're not good unless they practice and spend a lot of time and cost. Some of our golfers hit 1,000 golf balls a day. The pro golfer, 1,000 golf balls. I couldn't stand up if I hit 1,000. But they'll do it day in and day out, and that's the cost they have to pay to maintain the level of skills that they have. And what prevents us from easily being a disciple? Usually it's money and things, and it's been said, it's easy to become a disciple of things and not easy to become a disciple of Christ. I think that's very true. I'm guilty of it. When I read that, I have to hold the mirror up and look at myself. I'm very guilty of that. Things are in our lives. They're very important to us. Our lesson today just went through Luke 33. But I think I'm going to give a homework assignment. If you read Luke 34 through 35, and it talks about salt. See if I got the Bible handy. We'll read those two verses real quick, then I'll conclude. Linda, can you read Luke 14, 34 through 35?
34 and 35. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear.
That's right. Salt is, what is salt? Sodium chloride. It doesn't lose its. If you just let salt sit by itself, it doesn't lose its saltiness. It can stay salty for thousands of years. The only thing that can make it lose its saltiness is it's diluted. And that's the reference to 34 and 35. If we dilute our saltiness, then we're not as effective. All right. Well,
Just to underpin your comment
Yeah.
about disciples knowing Jesus ahead. All the disciples, with the exception of one, were from Galilee.
Yeah.
Only Judas Iscariot was not. Iscariot's really a place name located in the south and west of Jerusalem. All the others came from Galilee. So I think that underpins the fact that they all knew each other quite well in advance of the calling.
That's right, and when Jesus approached him, his comment was, now is the time.
Now
And they
is the
knew
time.
exactly
That's
what
the
he was
calling.
saying. Now is the time to go. Unless somebody has a quick comment, that's going to conclude the lesson. Bob?
I want the class to know that Mike's graduate of Cliff High School. I taught there for 11 years. Mike has traveled the world over, played golf in many places. At Glencliff High School, I cannot remember any part of our curriculum that says you need to build a basement under your house and move. We tried to teach our kids do right and wrong, so on like that, but sometimes, you can't teach stupidity.
Very good.